March 3, 1943. 09:55 hours. The Bismarck Sea. The cockpit smelled like high-octane avgas, unwashed flight suits, and the metallic tang of impending failure. It was the smell of men doing exactly what the manual told them to do, and knowing it was not going to work. Below the formation of B-25s, the Pacific Ocean was a vast, glittering blue slate. Crawling across it like steel beetles was the Tokyo Express. Enemy force 8 destroyers, 8 troop transports. Speed 20 knots. The Japanese convoy was moving roughly 3,000 infantrymen to reinforce Lae, New Guinea. They were protected by a screen of destroyers that threw up a wall of flak so thick you could walk on it. The American pilots were ordered to attack from medium altitude, safe according to the doctrine, effective according to the brass, useless according to physics. At 6,000 feet, a 500-pound demolition bomb takes roughly 20 seconds to reach sea level. In that 20-minute window, a Japanese destroyer captain spots the bay doors opening. He orders hard to starboard. At 20 knots, the ship displaces 600 feet from its original position. The bomb does not hit a ship. It hits a memory of a ship. The United States Army Air Forces called this precision bombing. Major Paul Irvin Gunn called it something else. We are just drilling holes in the water. We are not hitting a damn thing but fish. Gunn was not a hero. Not on paper. He was a 43-year-old logistical nightmare. A retread. A former enlisted Navy mechanic who had hustled his way into an Army officer uniform when the war kicked off. He had no West Point ring. He had no respect for the chain of command. He walked with a limp and talked like a stevedore. Most importantly, he was a man who looked at the B-25 Mitchell bomber, a glass-nosed, fragile instrument designed for high-altitude level bombing, and saw a lie. The plane was built for a war that did not exist. The standard B-25 had a greenhouse nose for a bombardier to sit in, clutching a Norden bomb sight that cost as much as a house. It was defended by a single, pathetic, 30-caliber flexible gun. To attack a ship, you had to fly straight and level, letting the enemy destroyers calculate your range, speed, and altitude. You were a clay pigeon with engines. The results were catastrophic. Morale was cratering. The Japanese Navy was reinforcing their island strongholds faster than the Allies could sink them. Allied status critical. Casualty rate rising. Hits confirmed 0. The stakes were binary, absolute. If this convoy reached Lae, the Japanese would overrun the Allied foothold in New Guinea. If New Guinea fell, the gateway to Australia was kicked wide open. The generals in Brisbane sent memo after memo demanding maximum effort. They wanted more bravery. They wanted pilots to fly straighter into the flak. Pappy Gunn knew bravery was useless against geometry. He did not need brave pilots. He needed a hacksaw. If he could not change the laws of physics, he would have to mutilate the plane. If he failed, he would face a court-martial for destroying government property. If he succeeded, he might just turn the Bismarck Sea into a graveyard. To understand why Paul Gunn had to rip an airplane apart, you have to understand the religion he was fighting against. It was the Church of High-Altitude Precision Bombing. Its Bible was the field manual. Its altar was the Norden bomb sight. Washington loved the Norden. It was an analog computer, a marvel of gears and gyroscopes that claimed it could drop a pickle into a barrel from 20,000 feet. It cost as much as a fighter plane. Bombardiers were sworn to destroy it with a .45 caliber pistol if their plane went down, to keep it out of enemy hands. It was a miracle, in theory. But theory does not survive contact with the humid, chaotic, violently maneuvering reality of the South Pacific. In Europe, the targets were factories, ball bearing plants. Refineries. They were made of brick and steel, and crucially, they did not move. They sat there and waited to be destroyed. Target type: Japanese destroyer Fubuki class. Max speed 38 knots. Turn radius 450 yards. In the Pacific, the target was a sliver of gray steel slicing through the waves at nearly 40 miles per hour. The Tokyo Express was not a static grid. It was a fluid, adaptive organism. The tactical deadlock was absolute. The Americans were flying B-17 Flying Fortresses and standard B-25 Mitchells. Their doctrine dictated bombing runs from between 5,000 and 10,000 feet. This altitude was supposed to keep them above the effective range of the light anti-aircraft fire, the 25mm pom-pom guns that shredded low-flying aircraft. The deadly math of the Pacific War comes down to time of fall. At 8,000 feet, a bomb released from a B-25 falls for approximately 24 seconds. It travels forward while falling, following a parabolic arc. The bombardier inputs wind speed, altitude, and drift into the Norden. He lines up the crosshairs. He releases. For 24 seconds, that bomb is a dumb object obeying gravity. It cannot correct its course. It cannot think. But the Japanese captain can. The Imperial Japanese Navy had developed a counter-doctrine that was humiliatingly simple. It relied on the fact that sound travels slower than light, but light travels instantly. Spotters on the destroyer deck would watch the American bombers through high-powered binoculars. They were not looking at the planes, they were looking for the separation. The moment the black dots left the bay. Hard to port! Flank speed! A Fubuki-class destroyer can shift its rudder hard over in 3 seconds. In the remaining 21 seconds of the bomb flight, the ship accelerates and turns. By the time the bomb splashes into the ocean, the destroyer is 400 yards away, cutting a hard wake in the opposite direction. The blast radius of a 500-pound bomb is roughly 50 yards against a hull. The math dictates a miss of 350 yards. The result was a grotesque waste of ordnance and fuel. Reconnaissance photos from early 1943 told the story. Hundreds of white geysers erupting in the Bismarck Sea. 0 burning ships. The Japanese called the high-altitude B-17s 4-engine scarecrows. They ignored them. They did not even bother zigzagging until the bombs dropped. They simply sailed their reinforcements right under the noses of the U.S. Army Air Forces, unloaded thousands of troops, and sailed back. Mission success rate less than 1%. Fuel consumed 1.2 million gallons. Pilot. Morale critical failure. Inside the cockpit, the frustration was physical. You fly for 4 hours over open water. You endure the heat, the vibration, the terror of Zeros diving out of the sun. You line up the shot perfectly. You do everything the manual says. And you watch your payload explode harmlessly in the water while the enemy sails on. It was not just ineffective, it was suicidal. To use the Norden bomb sight, the pilot had to fly straight and level for the bomb run. No evasion, no banking. Straight and level is a pilot term for dead. While the B-25 pilot held the plane steady for the bombardier, the Japanese anti-aircraft gunners on the ships and the shore batteries had a fixed solution. They filled the sky with flak. Shrapnel tore through aluminum skin. Engines caught fire. Men bled out in the back of the fuselage, all for a 0% hit rate. The brass in Washington, men who sat in air-conditioned offices and had never smelled burning avgas, blamed the pilots. They said the crews lacked discipline. They said they were not aiming well enough. They sent memos demanding tighter formations. General George Kenney, the commander of the Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific, knew better. He was an innovator, a man willing to listen to the weirdos and the outcasts. but even he was bound by the equipment he had. The B-25 Mitchell was a medium bomber. Its nose was made of plexiglass. It was designed to let a bombardier see the ground. It housed a single .30 caliber machine gun on a flexible mount, essentially a BB gun meant to scare off fighters. It was not a weapon, it was a gesture. A .30 caliber round weighs roughly 150 grains. It generates about 2,000 foot-pounds of energy. Against the 15mm steel plating of a destroyer bridge or hull, it bounces off like hail. To sink a ship, you need to punch through the hull. You need heavy ordnance delivered accurately. There was a theory floating around called skip bombing. The idea was to fly incredibly low, mast height, and drop the bomb so it skipped across the water like a stone, slamming into the side of the ship before exploding. It sounded perfect. It eliminated the time of fall problem. If you are 50 feet off the water, the bomb hits in seconds. The ship cannot dodge. But there was a catch, a fatal one. To skip bomb, you have to fly directly at the ship, head on. You have to stare down the barrels of 8 127mm main guns and 20 25mm autocannons. You have to fly into a wall of lead. The B-25 had no teeth. If a standard B-25 tried a skip bombing run, the Japanese gunners would simply chew through the glass nose, killing the bombardier and the pilot before they ever got close enough to release. The plane was defenseless in the forward arc. It was a glass-jawed fighter in a heavyweight bout. The pilots knew it. The crews knew it. Pappy Gunn knew it. Gunn walked the flight lines in Australia, looking at the battered B-25s. He saw the holes in the glass noses. He saw the blood on the floorboards. He saw the logistical reports of bombs dropped versus ships sunk. The system said, wait for the B-29s. They were years away. The system said, train harder with the Norden. Physics said no. The system said, you are not an engineer, Major Gunn. You are a glorified mechanic. Stay in your lane. Pappy Gunn decided to build a new lane. He realized that the problem was not the pilot, and it was not the bomb. It was the delivery vehicle. The B-25 was a bomber trying to do a strafer job. To make skip bombing work, you needed suppression. You needed to hit the ship so hard on the approach that the Japanese gunners kept their heads down. You did not need a .30 caliber tickle. You needed a sledgehammer. You needed to turn a glass house into a pillbox. But the engineers at North American Aviation said it could not be done. The center of gravity would shift. The nose gear would collapse. The vibration would rattle the rivets out of the airframe. The plane would stall and crash on takeoff. Adding 4 to 8 50 caliber machine guns to the nose adds approximately 600 to 900 pounds of weight to the extreme forward point of the aircraft. This shifts the center of gravity forward by 4 to 6 inches. In aviation aerodynamics, an out-of-limits forward center of gravity makes the aircraft nose heavy. The elevators lose authority. You pull back on the stick and the nose does not come up. You plow into the runway. The math said it was impossible. The manuals forbade it. The manufacturers disavowed it. Pappy Gunn lit a cigar, grabbed a wrench, and looked at the terrified young engineers in his unit. He did not care about the center of gravity. He cared about the center of the Japanese fleet. Throw away the books, Gunn growled. We are going to put guns in this bastard until it dips when it sits on the tarmac. The hangars at Eagle Farm in Brisbane, Australia did not look like a high-tech aviation facility. They looked like a chop shop. It was 105 degrees in the shade. The air shimmered with heat and the blue-white arc of welding torches. This was Pappy Gunn Kingdom. While the generals and the air-conditioned headquarters in the city debated grand strategy, Gunn was waist-deep in hydraulic fluid, stripping the dignity out of the United States Army Air Force. He started by committing heresy. He threw the Norden bomb sight in the trash. To the Air Corps, this was like a priest burning a Bible. The Norden was the raison d'etre of the bomber. Without it, the B-25 was just a heavy, slow transport plane. Gunn did not care. He ordered his mechanics to rip out the bombardier seat, the optical glass, and the delicate gyroscopes. He left a hollow void in the nose of the aircraft, a glass bubble filled with nothing but hot air. Now, he had to fill it with death. Resource check, factory parts. 0. Available scrap, high. Gunn anger, critical. Gunn did not have a requisition form. He did not have blueprints from North American Aviation. He had a boneyard of wrecked P-40 fighters and a stockpile of Browning AN M2 50 caliber machine guns. The Mod Deuce. The Browning M2 is not a rifle. It is a kinetic energy engine. It fires a projectile that is half an inch in diameter and nearly 4 inches long. The slug weighs roughly 700 grains. When it leaves the barrel, it is traveling at 2,910 feet per second. Upon impact, it does not just pierce, it hydraulically shocks the target. If it hits a fuel tank, the friction heat ignites the vapor instantly. If it hits a human body, the hydrostatic shock liquefies organs 6 inches away from the entry wound. A standard B-25 had one flexible 30 caliber gun in the nose, a pea shooter. Gunn wanted to install 4 fixed 50 calibers in the nose and 4 more in blister packs on the side of the fuselage. That is 8 heavy machine guns. 8 guns firing at a cyclic rate of 800 rounds per minute equals 6,400 rounds per minute. That is 106 rounds hitting the target every single second. It is a wall of lead weighing 15 pounds per second, traveling at Mach 2.5. But you cannot just duct tape machine guns to an airplane. The first problem was the recoil. Each M2 generates hundreds of pounds of recoil force. When you fire 8 of them simultaneously, you are essentially attaching a rocket engine to the front of the plane, firing backwards. The North American Aviation field representative caught wind of what Gunn was doing. He drove out to the hangar, took one look at the welding torches, and nearly had a stroke. "Major, you cannot do this. The B-25 airframe is stressed for flight loads, not recoil loads. If you fire a burst, the vibration will shatter the plexiglass nose. It will pop the rivets on the fuselage skin. You will shake the wings off." It was a valid engineering concern. The nose of the B-25 was a greenhouse. It was structural framing holding glass. It was not designed to mount artillery. Gunn looked at the rep. He looked at the half-finished mounting bracket he had made from a scrap steel girder found in a rail yard. "Son," Gunn said, wiping grease from his forehead, "North American built this plane to drop bombs. I am rebuilding it to drop bastards. Now get out of my light." The engineering challenge was a nightmare. Gunn had to fabricate a cradle, a steel cage that would sit inside the glass nose and hold the 4 guns rigid. It had to be anchored to the main longerons, the spine of the aircraft, to transfer the recoil energy through the frame, bypassing the fragile glass. He did not have CAD software. He did not have a wind tunnel. He used chalk on the concrete floor. He mocked up the mounts using felt pads to absorb the shock and steel springs scavenged from railroad cars. Then came the feed problem. 8 machine guns eat ammunition at a terrifying rate. A standard ammo box holds 100 rounds. That is roughly 7 seconds of fire. Gunn needed more uptime. He needed sustained fire to suppress the flak on a long approach. He gutted the plane. He ripped out the crawlway that connected the nose to the cockpit. He filled the space with massive ammunition boxes, feeding belts of 50 caliber rounds through custom-made chutes that looked like the intestines of a robot. He turned the navigator compartment into a magazine. Then came the trigger problem. The pilot needed to fire these guns while flying the plane. The standard control yoke had a button for the radio and a button for the bombs. Gunn rewired the entire system. He rigged a solenoid switch, an electromagnetic actuator, to the trigger of each gun. He wired them all to a single button on the pilot control wheel. One button, 8 solenoids, 8 firing pins dropping simultaneously. Modification status, 85%. Structural integrity, unknown. Weight balance, critical error. Then came the problem that the engineers warned him about. The center of gravity. Gunn had just added nearly 2,000 pounds of guns, ammo, and steel plating to the nose of the plane. An aircraft is a teeter-totter. The wings are the fulcrum. If you put too much weight on the nose, the tail lifts. If the tail lifts too high, the elevators, the control surfaces that pitch the nose up, lose their leverage. At takeoff speed, the pilot pulls back on the stick, but the nose is too heavy. The plane refuses to fly. It runs off the end of the runway and explodes. The NAA rep was back, waving a slide rule. "It will not rotate," he screamed. "It is a lawn dart." Gunn did not panic. He improvised. If the nose was too heavy, he had to lighten it or weigh down the tail. He could not lighten the nose. He needed every gun. So he moved the radio equipment from the front to the back. He threw out the co-pilot armor plating. He figured the guns were the armor. He even loaded lead ballast into the tail cone. He balanced the scales. But the plane was now heavy, sluggish, a beast. It was ugly. It was unauthorized. It was perfect. They called it the B-25 Strafer, or the Commerce Destroyer. The nose was no longer clear glass. It was painted over, bristling with black barrels. It looked like an angry hornet. But the resistance was not done. The brass in Washington heard about the modifications. They sent a cable. "Cease and desist. Unauthorized modifications. Return aircraft to standard configuration." General Kenny, the only man with stars on his shoulder who understood the score, intercepted the message. He looked at gun prototype sitting on the tarmac, heat waves radiating off the aluminum. Kenny had a choice: obey the regulations and lose the war in the Pacific, or let the crazy mechanic loose. He turned to Gunn. "Can she fly, Pappy?" Gunn spat a stream of tobacco juice. "General, she is heavy. She handles like a dump truck, but she will fly." "And the guns?" "General," Gunn grinned, a predatory expression that did not reach his eyes. "When you pull that trigger, the plane actually stops in midair from the recoil. It kicks like a mule. But whatever is in front of you, it just evaporates." Kenny crumpled the telegram from Washington. "Take it up," Kenny said. "Show me." Gunn climbed into the cockpit of the first prototype, the Margaret. He fired up the twin Wright Cyclone engines. The plane vibrated, heavy and mean. He taxied to the runway. The engineers held their breath. The NAA rep covered his eyes. Gunn throttled up. The engines roared. The plane lumbered down the strip, gaining speed agonizingly slowly. The nose gear stayed glued to the tarmac. 80 miles per hour, 90 miles per hour, 100 miles per hour. The end of the runway was rushing up. At the last possible second, Gunn hauled back on the yoke. The nose rose, reluctantly, heavily, but it rose. The Strafer clawed its way into the humid Queensland air. He took it out over the bay. He found an old shipwreck on a reef. He lined it up. He flipped the master arm switch. He squeezed the trigger. The cockpit filled with the smell of cordite. The floorboards hammered against his boots.
The noise was deafening, a chainsaw roar that drowned out the engines. The airframe shuddered violently, the recoil slowing the plane by 10 knots instantly. Down below, the water around the shipwreck did not just splash. It boiled. The wooden hull of the wreck disintegrated into splinters. The coral reef was pulverized into white dust. Gunn landed, the tires screeching under the extra weight. He taxied back to the stunned silence of the crowd. He cut the engines. He leaned out the window, looking at the pale face of the manufacturing rep. "Whatever you do," Gunn yelled over the cooling turbines, "do not tell the guys in Washington. They might want a patent." The hack was complete. The B-25 Mitchell was no longer a medium bomber. It was a flying shotgun. But a test firing on a stationary wreck is one thing. The Bismarck Sea was waiting. 8 Japanese destroyers, fully alerted, bristling with anti-aircraft guns, and crewed by men who had never seen a B-25 fly at mast height. The tactical deadlock was about to be broken by brute force. Weapon status: online. Doctrine rewritten. Time to intercept 12 hours. March 3, 1943, 10,000 hours, 50 feet above sea level. The horizon was a blur of tropical haze and adrenaline. 12 B-25 Mitchells from the 90th Squadron, the Paradise Squadron, dropped out of the clouds. But they did not level off at 8,000 feet. They kept dropping. 6,000 feet, 3,000 feet, 1,000 feet. On the bridge of the Japanese destroyer Arashio, the lookouts shouted warnings. They had seen American bombers before. They knew the drill. The captain ordered the helm hard over, preparing to dodge the high-altitude seeds of failure. He ordered his anti-aircraft crews to scan the sky. But the Americans were not in the sky. They were on the deck. Altitude 50 feet. Speed 275 miles per hour. Formation line abreast. The B-25s were flying so low their prop wash was kicking up spray from the ocean surface. To the Japanese gunners, this did not make sense. A bomber at this altitude was suicide. It was a target bigger than a barn door. The Japanese crews rushed to their 25mm autocannons, grinning. They swung the barrels down, anticipating an easy kill. They had no idea that they were staring into the barrels of Paul Gunn heresy. The engagement began not with a bomb, but with a buzzsaw. At 1,000 yards out, the lead B-25 pilot, Major Ed Larner, pressed the button on his yoke. The result was physics made manifest. The strafer did not just fire, it roared. The airframe shuddered as 8 50-caliber machine guns erupted simultaneously. Kinetic energy transfer. A single 50-caliber round carries enough energy to punch through 7/8-inch steel plate at 100 yards. When 8 guns fire for a 3-second burst, they release approximately 250 rounds. This concentrates over 4 million foot-pounds of energy into an area the size of a doorway. On the Arashio, the effect was instantaneous and horrific. The Japanese gunners did not have time to fire back. The storm of lead shredded the gun shields. It punched through the steel skin of the bridge. It turned the men inside into a red mist. The 25mm guns fell silent, their crews liquefied before they could pull a trigger. The bridge officers were cut in half. The glass windows of the destroyer shattered inward. It looked like we were hosing them down. The decks were just swept clean. One minute they were manning the guns, the next minute there was nothing but piles of rags. This was the suppression Gunn had promised. The tactical deadlock, the wall of flak that prevented low-level attacks, had been broken. Not by dodging it, but by killing the men firing it. But the B-25s were still closing. 275 miles per hour. The ship was rushing toward the windshield at a terrifying rate. Distance to target,
400 yards. Closure rate 400 feet per second. Now came the second half of the hack, the skip bomb. In a standard run, this is the moment the pilot would pull up to avoid a collision. But the doctrine had changed. The pilots held the nose down. They aimed the entire airplane at the burning waterline of the destroyer. At 300 yards, Larner released the 500-pound bomb. The physics of the skip. A bomb is a cylinder. When it hits water at a shallow angle, less than 15 degrees, with high forward velocity, 250 plus miles per hour, surface tension acts like a solid ramp. The bomb does not sink. It ricochets. It bounces off the water surface, maintaining 80% of its kinetic energy, traveling parallel to the waves. The bomb hit the water 50 yards in front of the Arashio. It skipped once, a massive steel stone. It slammed into the side of the destroyer right at the waterline. The fuse had a 5-second delay. Just enough time for the B-25 to pull up over the shipmast. Thump. Count to 4. Boom. The explosion broke the Arashio back. The ship did not sink gracefully. It hogged, the bow and stern rising as the keel snapped, then collapsed into the sea. But there was not time to celebrate. The sky was full of aluminum and tracers. This was not a duel. It was a barroom brawl. Pappy gun modifications were being tested to the breaking point. In one B-25, the vibration from the 8 nose guns was so violent it shook the instrument panel loose. The pilot flew by feel, the smell of burnt gunpowder filling the cockpit, his eyes locked on the next transport ship. System alert, gun number 3 jammed, barrel overheat. Ignoring. The Japanese convoy broke formation. It was panic. The troop transports, fat, slow targets carrying thousands of soldiers, were defenseless. The destroyers, their protectors, were burning hulks. The commerce destroyers lined up for the slaughter. It was a conveyor belt of destruction. One B-25, piloted by Lieutenant Hawk Hennebrey, lined up on a transport ship. He opened up with the nose guns. The tracers walked up the side of the hull, blowing out portholes, igniting deck cargo. He released his bomb. It skipped perfectly. But as he pulled up, a hidden anti-aircraft gun on the transport stern barked to life. The false defeat. A 20mm shell tore through Hennebrey's left engine. Oil sprayed over the cowling. The prop feathered. The B-25 lurched, dipping a wing toward the ocean. In a standard high-altitude bomber, losing an engine on a run was a death sentence. You could not maintain altitude. You dropped out of the formation, and the Zeros ate you alive. But Hennebrey was not at 8,000 feet. He was at 50 feet. He did not need to hold altitude. He just needed to keep his momentum. Gunn had stripped so much weight out of the useless parts of the plane, the co-pilot armor, the bombardier station, the heavy radio gear moved aft, that the plane was surprisingly resilient. Hennebrey fought the yoke. He jammed the rudder pedal to the floor to counter the torque of the single good engine. I kicked the rudder so hard I thought I snapped the cable. But the old girl leveled out. She wanted to fly. Hennebrey limped away, skimming the waves. He did not crash. He did not bail out. He flew the damaged strafer 200 miles back to base on one lung. The innovation survived the test. Back in the Bismarck Sea, the battle had turned into a turkey shoot. The Japanese Zeros, stationed at nearby Leh to protect the convoy, dived in to stop the massacre. They expected slow bombers. They found gunships. Usually, a Zero would attack a B-25 from the front, knowing the bomber had no forward firepower. It was the standard head-on tactic. It was a fatal mistake. 3 Zeros dived on a flight of strafers. They lined up for a head-on pass. They expected the B-25s to break formation. Instead, the The B-25 pilots simply lifted their noses slightly. 32 50-caliber machine guns opened fire on the three Zeros. The closing speed of a head-on pass is roughly 600 miles per hour. At that speed, reaction time is 0.5 seconds. The Zeros flew into a saturation grid of lead. There was no dogfight. The Zeros simply disintegrated in midair, turned into confetti by the sheer density of fire. The Japanese pilots realized too late. The rules had changed. The prey had become the predator. By 10:20 a.m., 20 minutes after the attack began, the firing stopped. Not because the Americans were retreating, but because there was nothing left to shoot. The scene below was apocalyptic. The Bismarck Sea was stained black with oil and red with blood. Thousands of Japanese soldiers were in the water. Wreckage bobbed in the swell. Japanese losses: destroyers sunk 4. Transports sunk 8. Troops lost approximately 3,000. The math of the high-altitude doctrine had promised a 1% hit rate. Pappy Gunn junkyard math had delivered a 90% annihilation rate. The pilots turned for home. Their bomb bays were empty. Their gun barrels were warped from heat. Their fuselages were blackened with soot. Inside the cockpit, the mood was not triumphant. It was numb. They had just conducted industrial-scale slaughter. They had seen the faces of the men they killed on the decks. It was intimate violence. When you drop a bomb from 10,000 feet, you kill a coordinate. When you strafe a ship from 50 feet, you kill people. You see them burn. You see them jump. This was the cost of the hack. It removed the clinical distance of air warfare. It made the pilot an executioner. As the squadron approached the airfield at Port Moresby, they did not radio for landing instructions. They performed a victory roll, a buzz job over the tower. General Kenny was waiting on the tarmac. He counted the planes. They were all there. Some had holes in them. Some were leaking oil. But they were back. He watched the crews climb out. They looked exhausted. They looked like men who had walked through a furnace. Pappy Gunn was there too. He was not looking at the pilots. He was looking at the planes. He was checking the rivets on the nose mounts. He was checking the stress fractures on the glass. "Hey, Pappy!" one of the pilots yelled, patting the scorching hot nose of his B-25. The vibration damn near rattled my teeth out. But that gun sight? It did not move a millimeter. Gunn just nodded. He took a drag of his cigar. He knew what had happened out there. He knew that the manuals were burning in the Bismarck Sea. The system had said it was impossible to put 8 guns in the nose. The system had said you could not skip bomb a destroyer. The system had said Pappy Gunn was just a mechanic. The system was wrong. The mechanic was right. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was not just a victory. It was a paradigm shift. In 20 minutes, the Imperial Japanese Navy ability to reinforce New Guinea was deleted. The Tokyo Express was derailed permanently. The data came in later that night. It was staggering. Final score: Allied aircraft lost 2. Japanese ships sunk 12. Japanese aircraft destroyed 20 plus. To victory. It was the most lopsided naval victory in history, and it was not won by a new secret weapon from a laboratory in Washington. It was won by scrap metal, welding torches, and a refusal to accept the word impossible. But wars are not won by machines. They are won by the men who fix them. And as the pilots celebrated, drinking warm beer and recounting the slaughter, Pappy Gunn went back to the hangar. He had an idea for a 75mm cannon, a cannon the size of a tank gun. He wondered if he could fit that in the nose of a B-25. The smoke over the Bismarck Sea eventually dissipated. The oil slicks drifted apart. The sharks finished their work. In the days following the massacre, the headlines in the United States screamed victory. General MacArthur issued a communique calling it one of the most complete and annihilating combats of all time. General Kenny was hailed as a visionary air power strategist. The pilots of the 90th Squadron were treated like rock stars, their exploits retold in newsreels across the globe. But in the sweltering hangars of Brisbane, the man who engineered the victory was already under a new plane, welding torch in hand. Paul Gunn did not get a ticker tape parade. There is a cruel irony in military innovation. When you break the rules and fail, they court-martial you. When you break the rules and succeed, they steal your blueprints. North American Aviation, the same company whose representatives had screamed that the nose guns were aerodynamically impossible, took one look at the combat reports from the Bismarck Sea and went back to the drawing board. They stopped building the glass-nosed B-25 bombers. They tooled their factories in California. New production model, B-25J Strafer, standard issue 8 nose guns. They mass-produced Pappy gun heresy. The solid-nose B-25 became the scourge of the Pacific. It hunted shipping, trains, and airfields from the Philippines to Okinawa. The Strafer was not an outlaw modification anymore. It was doctrine. It was the standard. Gunn received the Legion of Merit. A nice medal, but he did not care about the ribbon. He cared about the result. "I do not need a medal," Gunn told a reporter. "I need to get to Manila." This was the secret engine driving the mechanic madness. Pappy Gunn was not just trying to win the war for abstract reasons. His wife and 4 children were trapped in the Philippines. They were prisoners in the Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila. Every ship he sank, every gun he mounted, every law of physics he broke was a calculation of distance. He was clearing a path to his family. He was a father with a blowtorch. Pappy Gunn kept hacking until the very end. He put a 75mm cannon, a literal tank gun, into the nose of a B-25. It rattled the airframe so hard the rivets popped, but it could sink a destroyer with a single shot. He experimented with rocket pods. He turned the A-20 Havoc into a low-level shredder. He was the grandfather of the modern gunship. The AC-130s and A-10 Warthogs of today, flying artillery batteries designed to loiter and destroy, can trace their DNA directly back to that scrap heap in Brisbane. When General MacArthur finally waded ashore in the Philippines in 1944, Pappy Gunn was flying overhead. He was one of the first Americans to land in Manila. He personally kicked down the gates of the internment camp. He found his family. They were starving, sick, but alive. The odds of a family surviving 3 years of Japanese internment were less than 40%. The odds of a single mechanic changing the course of the Pacific War were statistically 0. Pappy Gunn beat the math every time. But peace is often harder on warriors than war. After the surrender, Gunn retired. He did not go into politics. He did not write a memoir. He started a small charter airline in the Philippines. He flew chickens, mail, and medicine to remote islands. He went back to being a mechanic who could fly. On January 16, 1957, Pappy Gunn took off in a small Beechcraft plane. He flew into a severe thunderstorm. The turbulence was too much for the light aircraft. It crashed into the jungle. The man who had survived the Zeros, the flak, the court-martials, and the Bismarck Sea died alone in the trees. History is written by the generals. If you open a standard history book about World War II, you will see photos of MacArthur in his sunglasses. You will read about Nimitz and Halsey. You might find a footnote about the B-25 Strafer, but you rarely see the name Paul Gunn. He was the unsung innovator. The man who looked at a broken system and did not file a complaint, he filed a piece of metal. He represents the terrifying effectiveness of American ingenuity when it stops following the manual and starts using its hands. He proved that sometimes the difference between defeat and victory is not a new strategy or a brilliant speech. Sometimes it is just 8 machine guns and a roll of duct tape. Paul "Pappy" Gunn died without the Medal of Honor. The brass considered his contributions technical rather than combat valor, despite him flying combat missions in the very planes he built. He saved thousands of Marine and Navy lives by destroying the convoys that would have killed them. Do not let his story die in the jungle. If you believe the mechanic who hacked the Air Force deserves to be remembered as a titan of the Pacific War, help us preserve this history. Do you think Major Paul Gunn engineering innovation was worth more to the war effort than personal combat bravery? Should there be a Medal of Honor for tactical innovation? Let us know in the comments.